Pippa Jones on TRE.
We're back. I've got the wonderful Tony Gosling with me. And as I said, he's the only man really for the job to help me, and hopefully you listeners as well, at least get a realistic perspective and some perhaps less accessible information about what we've seen over the last week and the bigger picture, of course. Good morning, Tony. Good afternoon.
Yes, we've given up with that other phone, which didn't seem to be playing ball with us, did it, Pippa?
Yeah, you see, I don't know. I think your information is far too, what's the word I'm looking for? They're trying to interfere with your broadcast. Dangerous is perhaps a good word. Tony, let me start. We've got a lot to cover. Obviously, it's less than a week since these Paris attacks, and there are so many issues. I said to you earlier, it makes my head spin. I get dizzy. It hurts to think about it. And you said, well, Pippa, that's exactly what they want to do.
That's right. I think when it comes to big events like this now, I always, my whole attitude to life is give people the benefit of the doubt, basically. Let's not try and make a conspiracy out of nothing. And I was keeping very much an open mind last weekend about this, having picked up on it late on Friday evening, obviously, after we finished our show in Bristol. And I think it was probably Sunday morning, Sunday lunchtime. I just thought, right, okay, that's enough now. There is enough evidence already to suggest that this is a put-up job rather than some kind of genuine Middle East-based, sort of caves in Afghanistan attack. That there's got to be either, or probably both, some complicity from the Western media and the authorities in France, particularly. So the point at which I flipped,
yes, tell me,
was I'm not having any more of this. Was coming across the second eyewitness testimony of the shooters not being from the Middle East, but being white people. Now, okay, so maybe one person might get it wrong or whatever, but when you've got two, in fact, one of them saying that this is an eyewitness who was at the concert hall, saying that the shooter was a blonde guy and he didn't have a mask on, all of a sudden you start to ask questions. And the reason I do that is because I've got quite a thorough knowledge, really, of this Operation Gladio that took place right across Europe, mostly in Italy, but also in places like Belgium. I mean, I heard yesterday on the BBC that Belgium has never had terrorist attacks. Well, that's just a lie. In the 1980s, the Brabant massacres, there were scores of people. I think it was about 40 people killed in supermarket massacres in Belgium. So please don't tell me that Belgium has never had terrorist attacks. It's just not true. And that's what this, to me, is beginning to shape out. And I'll explain why. First of all, you've got the geopolitical context of it. That is to say, what's going on in Syria has reached a very... I mean, I was doing a radio interview with a website called Natural News and Hannah Borno last week. And I was saying, well, look, because the West has come up against this brick wall in Syria now with the Russian intervention, we really got to be aware that at any time there could be another big attack in Europe in order to kind of bounce the European population and politicians into complying with what the Americans want, which is effectively Europe to join them in Syria. Now, what that then ultimately means is you've got a very strong possibility of both Europe and America actually getting into a fight with Russia over Syria, in Syria. So we've got to keep out of Syria if we want to avoid a conflict with a nuclear power, basically. And I think that there's plenty of military people in Britain that do understand that. So there is a bit of pushback from the politicians like Cameron who are trying to push us into Syria. So that's the geopolitical context. And that then you start looking at, well, there's something bigger going on here rather than people being killed in Paris. There's a lot of other there's a lot of other spin-off which may come, and of course that is exactly what's been happening. We've had Cameron now saying, I'm not going to bother going to the United Nations. I think we should just go into Syria anyway because of what's happened in Paris. So they're using the tragedy of Paris as a pretext, as an excuse to advance their own military aims that they had anyway. The other thing I would suggest is always look at in these attacks, as in the Operation Gladio attacks, which were organised through NATO and using fascists in order to try and blame the left and blame the Russians back in the 1980s mostly.
But more recently, just to outline, Tony, more recently we saw that, of course, didn't we, in Ukraine, in Kiev?
Yes, that's right. And the target, you've got to look at the targets. Who are the targets in these attacks last Friday? Now, if as we're being told, this is an attack on the French state for what it's been doing and the French military in aiding the US in Syria, then they've basically just chosen the wrong targets, haven't they? They're going for ordinary, innocent civilians. And actually, if you look at the opinion polls in France are that ordinary members of the French public are actually largely against the military intervention in Syria by their government. So what you're doing, effectively, if this, supposedly is ISIS behind this, if it is an Islamic group, and I think there's a lot of evidence that ISIS is being steered and controlled and armed and basically given the money by Saudi and the Western allies, basically, that ISIS wouldn't be there if it wasn't for the West. That this just doesn't make any sense in terms of targeting, because what you're targeting is the people who are actually pressurising the French government not to get too involved in Syria. So that is just a basic fact that just seems to be, that was the same, of course, with the London bombings, just seemed to be completely counterproductive, the idea of blowing up innocent people. But what that does do is it persuades a lot of politicians, as well as general public, to turn to the state for protection. And this is a way of building a kind of police state and actually persuading people that they're going to have to give up the civil liberties that we're told is what our values are all about.
And then we're seeing the results of that already. Really sort of, curfews and armed raids and, countless people being hauled in or apartments, premises being
they're now
searched.
also talking, aren't they, about changing the French constitution. Now, this is surely exactly what the Islamists want, isn't it? Also, exercises. It's quite clear now. There's a really good article 2 days ago on Bloomberg, which really details the fact that there was exercise of mass casualties, terrorist attacks in Paris on Friday afternoon. This is one of those, having exercises on the same day is exactly the sort of characteristic of the apparent false flag attacks that we've had
Tony,
in the past.
when that happens once, and we see it once, it might be, it might be coincidence. It happens again. Well, strange coincidence. But there've been actually a number of these high-profile incidents where the very same day there has been a rehearsal of the authorities in terms of how they would deal with such and such a crisis.
Yeah, and that actually has a very useful effect for the perpetrators, and that is that you're able to confuse. For example, on the September the 11th attacks, the US air defences were going through a very similar exercise to the actual real attacks, and so there are actually recordings of them saying, is this real world or is this exercise? So they're not able to respond to a real world attack when they're going through an exercise. They think, well, what's happening? It's just an exercise. And so they have a kind of, paper response, but they don't have a real response. The other thing is that you've got a lot of the people who would normally deal with that sort of situation are actually out and about anyway, so they find themselves going from exercise to real world, and that's actually quite good, because you've got, for example, medical staff in the right place at the right time. I would think they would be rather fazed by that. Suddenly, gosh, it's another exercise. This is definitely a characteristic of these sorts of.
We saw it at the bombing of the Boston Marathon. There was actually a black ops operation there, wasn't there? That day that the two brothers who were hauled in for it detonated their bombs there.
I think so, yeah. And also you've got involvement of private security there. That was pretty clearly what was the way of actually the vector for the terrorism often is privatisation of security. You get a private company that's running a security, and then someone comes along and says, well, we would like to use your security company to get in, and it's done as a sort of Trojan horse to get into the whole situation. If you can control the security, then basically you can do what you want. But the other thing particularly to point out about last Friday, of course, is this passport, the fluttering passport. I was reading an independent article about that, where French police were actually talking about this whole thing as being a sophisticated propaganda exercise. Hang on, if the French police are saying that, so who would place a passport or near a dead body of a suicide bomber, in inverted commas, because I don't necessarily believe all these suicide bombers are exactly what they're told. For example, there are there are examples of where a suicide bomber has been reported all around the world for days, and then all of a sudden you read a local report and they say, well, it wasn't a suicide bombing at all, it was a missile fired from a helicopter. Now, I'm not saying that's what happened in Paris, but the evidence is never presented, obviously because it's too disgusting to look at for the public. But we've really got to question whether a suicide bombing really is a suicide bombing, or whether someone's, say, for example, had a small bomb put in their backpack that's then just been exploded by a remote control. There's no way to actually guarantee... I did an article for the National Union of Journalists newspaper probably 10 years ago now, just explaining that we should not be reporting suicide bombings without actual hard evidence. And that's what's happening, is lots and lots of reportings going on with no evidence associating to it. This is what really bothers me.
It's a really great way to instill fear in your neighbour, though, isn't it? You know, if you or about your neighbour, if you happen to live next door to somebody whose skin is the wrong colour and perhaps has origins in the Middle East, then actually, you know, there's quite a lot of indication that many people would look at them suspiciously. And this is perhaps one of the biggest issues that are coming out about all of this, and that is, of course, the questioning of the Schengen Agreement and the refugees coming into Europe.
Look, the suicide bombing thing is really, I think it's part of a psychological operation, effectively, is you don't question it. The other thing is, you look at the sort of person that would do that, has got to be kind of crazy, a bit like a sort of Japanese World War II kamikaze. Now, of course, this stuff does go on, but certainly there is absolutely no point, as we saw apparently at the stadium last Friday, of three guys wandering around with suicide belts, if we can believe this, turning up late to a football match with no tickets, expecting to get in. The security guard, we are told, then just discovered one of them had a suicide belt on, and rather than do anything else, just said, "Can you please just go away?" And then they went. Apparently, one of them went into McDonald's, and one person dies just by coincidence, or because they happen to be walking nearby one of these people. Now, this narrative just doesn't make any sense at all. But the psychology of it, as you're saying, there's a psychological operation. It just makes the people who are doing these things appear crazy. So we don't have to even consider that there might be some logic or some sanity to what they're doing. But that really does exactly mimic this 1980s Operation Gladio, where hundreds of people across Europe, innocent people in the streets, were murdered by fascists who were employed by NATO to get everybody scared. And this is why I point to the geopolitics, really, as the first issue. At the time, I mean, for example, of the Brabant supermarket massacres, which most people have forgotten about now, but they happened in the 1980s in Belgium. What was happening was that the Belgian Parliament and Belgian people were saying, we want to get the cruise missiles from the United States out of Belgium, and we've had enough of it. We think that they make us a target for Russian nuclear missiles, so why would we want them here? So there's this big discussion going on in Belgium, and they were about to vote on getting the cruise missiles out. And suddenly these guys in carnival masks appeared in supermarkets, massacred scores of people across space of several months and weeks, the apparent random attacks. It turned out that they were NATO special forces who were just murdering people in the street randomly, but the result was that it created this strategy of tension shockwave across the Belgian consciousness. Both politicians and the public and the media were all scared, and so they thought, oh, well, we better keep these cruise missiles, we need US protection. So this is the audacity of these sorts of attacks, and this is, I'm afraid, exactly what I was predicting literally 2 weeks ago, speaking on this interview on Natural News. And the passport thing for me was, in a way, the icing on the cake, because this is clearly a forged passport. The French authorities are saying they think that it indicates there's a sophisticated propaganda operation going on. The other thing I'd say is that the media timing of this, this is on a Friday evening, just after all of the media people, all the journalists go home. They've done a week of work and they're not going to be back at their desks for 2.5 days. If you want to bamboozle the public with a little scrutiny or a little questioning from the media, that's the perfect time to do it.
Tell me as well, if you will, because we've got obviously France being the country of target, and it was it less than a year ago that the Charlie Hebdo massacre took place. Now we know from that there was assertion that Hollande, who was struggling in the polls, but had also taken quite a stance on being outspoken about the anti-Russian sanctions that the rest of Europe was, getting into bed with America over. How does that fit into all of this? Because that's got to be relevant to what we're seeing now.
Well, I think you're quite right to point that out. Again, it's geopolitics. Look at what's happening in geopolitics. I would also point to the recent UN meeting where Putin was basically, that was the point at which they started bombing raids, the Air Force in Syria. And at that point, what you've got is a big change going on geopolitically. What was happening at the time behind the scenes in diplomatic circles is the US is desperately trying to twist the arm of the Europeans, particularly the Germans, to get involved, to say, well, hang on, yes, we're going to stick to this plan of regime change in Syria. The Germans and most of the other European countries are thinking, well, what's in this for us? Why would we want to have a war with Russia, let alone an economic war, a fighting war with the Russians over Syria? We don't want it. And so they said no. At the same exact week was when we had the US action and intervention against Volkswagen, which has led to about 100 billion euros being wiped off Volkswagen shares. So we've got to, I think, look at these things as in geopolitics. The Americans obviously had this information about Volkswagen as a sort of little card they were keeping up their sleeve, and then they said, right, well, now is the point to play it, because we're getting annoyed that you're not going along with our plans in Syria.
What about the Russian doping as well? I mean, that's got to be questioned, because, how many countries are responsible for putting out athletes that have been found to have been doping, and yet Russia suddenly is being banned from all world events because of inference that there is doping within their ranks?
Well, they say it's state-sanctioned doping. Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. The geopolitics here is all... I think what we're seeing is sort of big tectonic plates shifting. But the end game in all this, I think we've got to keep focused on. And also, what I try and do is to say, well, hang on, there is another narrative that we're not seeing. We're not seeing the sorts of questions asked in the press that we would expect a good interrogative set of journalists in London to ask those questions, or any capital in Europe. I mean, basic, simple things like, okay, so you say that this guy organised it and he's now been killed. Show us the evidence. And a lot of the time, the journalists simply do not question the police narrative, the government narrative. They just simply go along with what we're being told. And I find that really irritating and disturbing. Richard Cottrell, he was an MEP for the southwest of England and a journalist, and he wrote a book about this Gladio operation. But he said that when 7/7 happened, and he'd been working he was probably working as a journalist before I was even born. But when 7/7 happened, he said he realised that there were no real questions being asked by the press about what had happened that day, and that journalism as an honourable, truth-seeking profession in Britain was dead at that point. That's what he thought. I mean, I don't think that there's been any proper interrogation. The sort of questions I would like to see asked in this case are particularly about the things like the targeting. What is the point of people from the Middle East coming over, killing, blowing up, machine gunning innocent people in the street? Do they think it's going to aid their cause in any way? This question I haven't seen asked once, not one single time. Also, another question which maybe should have been asked is if this is, as we're being told, attacked by ISIS, do we bear responsibility from the West for supporting and arming the Syrian rebels for 3 years and aiding them in the Syrian civil war? Is this our responsibility for creating this menace? So that question, again, I haven't seen that asked anywhere. No. One other thing, of course, is that you've got this sort of almost Trojan horse story on the back of this, which is all to do with Syrian refugees. Well, now we know that none of these attackers apparently were Syrian refugees. They were all naturalised
which
people
also
from
raises
France.
the question, Tony, of course, of we're talking about the mastermind being a Belgian, naturalised Belgian, with perhaps some kind of connection to the train or the potential train hijacking, a couple of other things. You've got to wonder, with all of the recent information that we have about how our information is being watched and monitored, why is it not possible that something was known about these people if it was, as we're being told it was?
Well, you've got the ridiculous scenario of George Osborne standing at GCHQ in Cheltenham here, just around the corner from where I am, pontificating about cyber terrorism. Now, not only does he not know anything about cyber terrorism, also it's very well known amongst expert circles that terrorists do not use cyber methods to communicate. They will, speak either face-to-face. They certainly won't be using the internet. And yet, this attack in Paris has been used as an excuse, apparently, to bring in... we've heard the government saying, well, this is why we need the Snoopers Charter. We've got to be able to monitor everybody's internet traffic and this kind of thing. That's just a complete lie. And in fact, if you go into the technical press on the internet, there are many websites who are saying this. This is just rubbish. There's no excuse for this. The two aren't connected. The other thing I'll also point out is I think it was Monday night, Cameron gave his annual Mansion House speech, which is basically where the government, our elected, in inverted commas, government, because there's lots of questions growing in Britain, as in the States, about gerrymandering, postal voting fraud, that sort of thing. He gave his annual speech at the Mansion House to the City of London, and there he announced massive increases in MI5, in effectively what is a sort of secret police in Britain, and also the SAS, which are the same sort of special forces which have been responsible for the Gladio attacks in the 1980s, and also, I've spoken to special forces people, soldiers in Britain who've been working, they've been fighting in Syria covertly without the permission of Parliament, because they're signed off by the military and by the Prime Minister to do secret operations over there. So this is what they're doing. They're going into this whole kind of police state lockdown mode. And to be honest with you, Pippa, I can see in a few years' time Europe turning into this kind of Iraq situation where bombs can be going off anywhere and no one will be any the wiser as to who's planted them. That seems to be where they're trying to take us.
Tony Gosling, fascinating, helping with some of the questions and certainly raising others, as you would expect. I hope we can speak again soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Pippa. We managed to get there eventually.
We did indeed. We didn't let them get the better of us. Thanks, Tony.
No.